Welcome to another fantastic episode of Teacher on Your Computer. Okay, today you guys are going to be studying Is the Survey Fair? We're going to be learning about how to give a proper survey, what makes it fair, what can sometimes introduce a bias into the survey and make it bad. Alright, so if you want to know what a bowl of soup tastes like, do you need to eat all of the soup in the bowl? Or can you get a good idea of the taste just by trying a small sample? When you conduct a survey, it's not usually possible for you to survey every single person in the population that you're interested in, such as all female teenage shoppers or all of the students at your school. Talking to all those people would be incredibly difficult. Instead, statisticians collect information about a sample, a portion of the population. However, finding a representative sample, a sample that represents the whole population well, isn't easy. Okay, so unlike the soup, in which I can just stick my spoon in and I'm probably going to get a pretty good idea of what the soup tastes like, it's a bit more difficult when you're sampling people. As the social director of the class council, Raman would like to survey a few students about their interests. When Raman analyzes the results from the survey, he wants to make claims about the interests of all the students in his school. If he were to survey only students on the class council, for example, it might be hard to make claims about what all students think. Students who are on the class council may not have the same social interests as other students. Consider this idea as you think about the samples described below. So, here's where you're going to make sure your paper is ready for you to start answering. Here's your first question, 829A. If Raman wanted to generalize the opinions of all students at his school, would it make sense to go to the grocery store and survey people there? Why or why not? Hopefully, you notice that if he wanted to find opinions about his students, going to the grocery store isn't going to be a good idea because those aren't the students at his school. He may find some of the students from his school, but he's also going to find parents. He's going to find people who don't have any association with the school at all. And so this would not be a good representative sample because a lot of the people in there would not be among the population he's looking for. Okay, B. If he wanted to generalize the opinions of all students at his school, would it make sense to ask all of his friends at school? Why or why not? Okay, now this is a bit better because now we're just getting only people from his school. We're not mixing it in with other random people at the grocery store. However, if he's only talking to his friends, is he really going to get the full spectrum of different kinds of students? Many times we hang out with people who are a lot like us. If Raman is trying to find something that'll represent all the students, are his friends really diverse enough to represent all the different types of students at his school? Okay, C. If he wanted to generalize the opinions of all the students at his school, would it make sense to ask every third person who entered the cafeteria at lunch? Why or why not? All right, so here we're probably getting a bit closer. He's still at the school, but what are some of the things that might cause a problem here? Might it be that there are some students who don't eat lunch, and those students might represent a certain demographic that he's going to miss out on, a certain type of thinking student that he'll miss out on by only questioning those who are going to the cafeteria. Maybe not all students go to the cafeteria. Or maybe like some high schools, these students are allowed to go out to eat lunch, and so he's only getting the kids who stay at school for lunch. Okay, now in the previous questions that we looked at, whatever you answered is good, but we wanted you to think critically about, is this really going to represent all the school, or are we missing out on people by surveying in this fashion? Make sure your answers for 829 A, B, and C are written down on your paper. If you forgot to write some of those down on your paper, rewind the video now. Make sure to answer those on your paper as well. 830, there's a variety of ways to choose samples from a population you're studying. Every sample has features that make it more or less representative of a larger population. For example, if you want to represent all the students at your school, but you survey all of the students at school 30 minutes after the last class has ended, so you're only surveying students in the after-school program, you are likely to get a disproportionate number of students who play school sports, attend after-school activities, or go to after-school tutoring. Okay, so that would be an example of a survey that might not work well, because the group that might stay after school might not really be representative of all the students. There are a lot of students who don't stay after school, and they may be very different than the kind of student who would stay after school. So, 830A, if you ask the opinion of the people around you, then you have used a convenience sample. So, when you're doing convenience sample, it's just, who do I see around me? I'll ask you, you. That's a convenience sample. If you took a convenience sample right now, what would be some of those features of the sample? Would you expect a convenience sample to represent the entire student population at your school? Why or why not? Okay, so one thing we can say to that first question, if you were to do a convenience sample right now, everyone in your classroom is another 7th grader, but West Hills is much greater than just the 7th grade. We've got more students with more diversity. So for one, we're taking out all of those students who are in the 8th grade and ignoring their unique opinions and their unique perspectives. Also, might your class have some aspects to it that are different from others? Might there be a greater number of honors kids in this class or a lower number of honors kids? And would these make it so that this particular class does not represent the whole school? Probably not. In a convenience sample, you're really surveying a very small amount of people who are all together, and they're probably together for some reason, such as grade level. You guys are all the same grade level, which means we're now ignoring the 8th graders if we do convenience sampling. 830B, if you email or create an online questionnaire, then you have used a voluntary response sample. All right, so what are some features of the people in a voluntary response sample? Could it represent the sample of all of the students at the school accurately? Now, one thing I can say is if you're doing a voluntary sample, sometimes we're worried that there's only certain kind of people who are going to actually answer that email. Most people are going to say, you want me to take a survey? And they'll delete the email and never even attempt it. So is the group of people who would actually respond different than the group that decided to ignore you? In which case, there's an entire group of people that won't be represented because they simply didn't take it. Your voluntary response sample might be a group of people with a lot of time on their hands, and that's why they're willing to do it. In which case, all the busy people aren't taking it. Okay, so you're missing out in that way. If you use a cluster sample, you first divide the students into smaller groups so that each of the smaller groups represents all of the students at your school. Then you randomly select one or more of these groups to be the sample. How might you divide the students at your school into groups that each represent the whole school? Okay, so think about the different types of groups that we have at the school, and we would want to start making sure that each of those groups is going to be represented. So one thing could be boys and girls. Another might be 7th and 8th graders. These are different groups. Now, if I'm doing a cluster sample, I'm going to pick so many 7th and 8th graders. I'm going to pick so many boys and girls. I could also make those groups, I could have more groups rather than just two. I could say 7th grade boys, 7th grade girls, 8th grade boys, 8th grade girls. And I can make sure I have 4 different clusters, each with some randomly selected students who represent those groups. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe we're thinking, the Latino students are somewhat different than the Pacific Islander students and represent a different cultural heritage. And so we want that. So we would want 7th grader Latino boys and so on and so on. Depending on what kind of survey you're going to do, you may or may not want a lot more clusters, and you're going to want some randomly selected students from each clusters. Now, are there reasons that these clusters might not be fully representative of all the students at your school? Always. There are so many things that make us all unique and different from one another. And while there are many things that make us the same, when you're trying to create a cluster, it's nearly impossible to account for all the things that make us different. All the things that could put us into different types of groups that represent different types of thinking and ideas. However, cluster sample out of all these is probably the best we've seen so far at creating a survey that's going to really represent the students. All right, so here you guys should make sure to write down our answers for each of these blanks. What we're going to do is try to write down what each of these actually represents, the population. So the top one is saying, if we did a sample by calling all of the 100th names in the phone book, you'll notice over on the right it says the description of that would be people with phones who also have their numbers listed. Okay, so we want to identify the population. Before I answer, make sure to write in your own answers and type them into the questions. So, for this first one, survey of people who come to the Vote Now booth at a high school football game. Well, one, we know these are the type of students who go to football games. As someone who did not go to a lot of football games, this would not have represented me. I would not have been represented in a survey who go to football games. Another thing about this group is that they're going to a Vote Now booth. So these are also students who care about electing people in school activities, be that prom king or queen or things for the yearbook. But these are kids who are very active in school activities. But not all students are going to be that into it, and so we would not get them inside of this survey.